Captain William Dabney did not need a watch to know the shelling was about to start. He could feel it in the air on Hill 881 South. His Marines called the incoming rounds by the sound they made in the last half-second before impact. On the morning of January 21, 1968, that sound came early. Dabney commanded India Company, part of the 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines. His job was a bald red hilltop of shattered trees and torn earth, roughly 2 kilometers northwest of the main base at Khe Sanh. His orders were simple and nearly impossible. Hold this hill, do not let them take it. Because if this hill fell, the artillery spotters on it fell with it, and the entire valley below went blind. The North Vietnamese had been moving into the hills around Khe Sanh for weeks. Whole divisions of them, more men than anyone in that valley wanted to count. The air smelled of cordite and wet clay and the particular rot of a jungle that never fully dried. Below Dabney, in the valley, sat the Khe Sanh combat base, a scrape of red dirt with a single aluminum airstrip, the westernmost American outpost in South Vietnam, only a few kilometers from the border with Laos and just south of the demilitarized zone that split the country in two. Behind that base stood nothing that could stop a determined enemy. The nearest overland relief was blocked. Route 9, the one road in, had been cut. For the men on the hills and the men on the base, there was no line to fall back to. There was only the sky. That morning the sky was low and grey, and the enemy knew it. Before we go further into that valley, I need to ask you for something small. Cold War Impact is an independent history channel, and lately our reach has fallen off a cliff. If you find value in carefully researched stories like this one, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who cares about history. Every like, every comment, every share tells the algorithm that this work is worth showing to other people. It is the only thing that keeps a small channel like this one alive and lets me keep making these deep dives. Thank you. Now, back to the hills above Khe Sanh. For 77 days, 2 of the most experienced divisions in the North Vietnamese army would surround roughly 6,000 United States Marines and their South Vietnamese allies at Khe Sanh. The enemy had artillery dug into the mountains of Laos, mortars ranged in on every corner of the base, and trenches that crept closer to the wire night after night, like something out of the First World War. Every classic sign of a siege, designed to end in a massacre, was present. The world watched, because the world remembered what had happened 14 years earlier at a place called Dien Bien Phu. The weapon that finally broke that siege was not a new rifle. It was not a miracle tank or a secret rocket. It was not even a single machine at all. It was an idea about how to use the sky, an idea so vast in scale that the men who planned it borrowed the name of the largest waterfall they could think of. And to understand how a curtain of falling bombs saved 6,000 men from becoming the next Dien Bien Phu, we have to go back to a French valley in 1954 and to a lesson the United States thought it had already learned. In the spring of 1954, a French garrison sat in a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam. The place was called Dien Bien Phu. The French had deliberately planted their men in a low basin ringed by high ground, and they had done so on purpose, hoping to lure the enemy into a stand-up battle where French artillery and air power could destroy him. They had assumed the Vietnamese Communist forces could never haul heavy artillery up those steep jungle slopes. They were wrong. The Viet Minh, led by General Vo Nguyen Giap, dragged their guns up the mountains piece by piece, sometimes by hand, and dug them into the reverse slopes where French counterfire could not reach them. They massed far more force than the French believed possible. They cut the garrison off from overland relief and slowly strangled its air resupply, until the only way in or out was a parachute drop through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire. Then they tightened the noose with trenches, digging forward night after night, inching toward the French strongpoints until the defenders were fighting hand-to-hand for scraps of mud. After 56 days, the garrison surrendered. Around 11,000 French and colonial troops marched into captivity, and many of them would never come home. The defeat broke French political will. Within weeks, France agreed to leave Indochina, and the country was divided into a communist north and a non-communist south, the very division that the war at Khe Sanh would be fought over. One battle in one valley had ended an empire's war. 14 years later, American commanders looked at a map of Khe Sanh and felt a cold sense of recognition. A remote base, high ground all around, a single vulnerable road, an enemy massing in the hills with heavy guns. The parallel was so exact that it haunted the highest levels of the United States government. President Lyndon Johnson became consumed by it. He had a terrain model of the Khe Sanh Plateau built and installed in the basement of the White House, in the room where his staff tracked the war. He studied it. He wanted daily updates. He famously demanded that the Joint Chiefs of Staff sign a formal statement promising him that Khe Sanh could and would be held. He is often quoted as saying he did not want any damn Dien Bien Phu, mangling the name in his Texas drawl, and whether or not the words are exact, the fear behind them was real. The President of the United States was terrified that a hill in Vietnam was about to become the graveyard of his war. The man who put the Marines there was General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam. Westmoreland wanted Khe Sanh held for reasons that made sense on paper. The base sat astride infiltration routes that fed men and supplies out of Laos and down into the northern provinces of South Vietnam. Much of that flow moved along the network of jungle roads and trails the Americans called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which ran through supposedly neutral Laos just beyond the border. Khe Sanh was the closest thing the Americans had to a lock on that door. It could serve as a western anchor for the thin defensive line strung below the demilitarized zone, as a base for patrols that watched the border, and as a potential jumping-off point for future operations into Laos to sever the enemy's supply network at its throat. To a commander who wanted to take the war to the enemy's lifeline, giving up Khe Sanh looked like surrendering the one position from which that lifeline could someday be cut. But Westmoreland also believed something that his critics would question for the rest of his life. He believed that if the North Vietnamese army massed its divisions around Khe Sanh to try to overrun it, they would be handing him a gift. For years, the enemy had been maddeningly hard to find. They melted into the jungle and the villages and struck only when it suited them. But if they concentrated tens of thousands of men in the open hills around a single American base, they would finally be a target that American firepower could destroy. Westmoreland did not fear a siege. He wanted one. What he needed was a way to turn the sky itself into a weapon. The enemy commander understood the ground just as well. The North Vietnamese committed enormous force to the operation, built around 2 full divisions. The 304th Division was a hardened unit with deep roots. Some of its veterans had fought at Dien Bien Phu itself, and they carried that memory into these hills like a battle standard. The 325th C Division held the high ground to the north. 2 more divisions, the 320th and the 324th, operated in the wider region to threaten the area and tie down American reserves. Estimates of the total force ranged widely, from perhaps 20,000 to as many as 40,000 troops available to the campaign, though the number pressing directly on Khe Sanh at any one moment was smaller. They brought artillery and rockets and mortars, positioned in Laos and in the reverse slopes of the hills, exactly as Giap's gunners had done in 1954. They began digging their approach trenches. They cut the road. Every move followed the Dien Bien Phu script, and every move was watched by an enemy who was quietly betting that this time the script would end differently. Here is what the North Vietnamese planners believed, and their belief was not foolish. They believed that a remote base at the end of a cut road could be strangled. They believed that if they could keep the airstrip under constant fire, they could choke off the supplies and reinforcements that kept it alive. And they believed that American air power, for all its noise, could not stop a well-dug-in army from grinding a fixed position into dust. They had seen American bombing before. They had learned to dig, to move at night, to hug close to their enemy so that the big bombers would not dare to strike for fear of hitting their own men. The one thing they did not fully account for was the sheer scale and precision of what the Americans were about to unleash, and the fact that the Americans had spent months preparing to see them in the dark. The idea already existed, it just had to be assembled. Even before the main siege began, American intelligence had detected the buildup around Khe Sanh. Reconnaissance flights, radio intercepts, and patrols all pointed to the same alarming conclusion. Whole enemy divisions were converging on the plateau. In the 3rd week of January, General Westmoreland set in motion a plan to concentrate the full weight of available air power on the area. He gave it a name meant to capture exactly what he intended. He called it Operation Niagara, after the Great Falls, because he wanted a cataract of bombs and shells to pour down onto the enemy without pause, day after day, in a torrent that would never let up. The operation came in two parts. The first phase, sometimes called Niagara 1, was about seeing. This was the harder problem, and in some ways the more remarkable one. An enemy who moves only at night, under triple canopy jungle, is almost impossible to target with bombs, because you cannot hit what you cannot find. For years, American planners had been developing electronic sensors, originally meant to detect infiltration along the demilitarized zone, part of an ambitious and controversial barrier concept, championed by the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. Now those same devices found their true purpose. Aircraft seeded the hills, valleys and trails around Khe Sanh with them. Some of the sensors listened for sound, the voices of men, the grind of an engine, the clank of equipment. Others were designed to feel the ground tremble under marching feet and rolling trucks and register the vibration. Dropped from the air, they hung in the trees or buried themselves in the soil and waited. When they detected activity, they radioed their readings to aircraft orbiting high above, which relayed the data to an analysis center far to the rear, where technicians watched the signals bloom on their equipment. For the first time in the war, on this scale, planners could sense an enemy moving through the jungle in total darkness, plot roughly where a column was, work out the direction it was heading, and predict where it would be in an hour. Then they could arrange for that patch of jungle to be waiting under a stack of bombs when the enemy arrived. The valley was no longer blind. It had grown a nervous system, and the enemy did not fully understand that he was being felt in the dark. The second phase, Niagara 2, was the destruction. And the instrument of that destruction was already in theater, flying missions that most of the men at Khe Sanh had learned to take for granted. It was the B-52 Stratofortress, a massive 8-engine bomber built to carry nuclear weapons across oceans. In Vietnam, it had been repurposed to carry dozens of conventional bombs, and its area bombing missions were code-named Arc Light. A single cell of 3 of these bombers, flying so high they could not be seen or heard from the ground, could turn a rectangle of jungle into a moonscape in seconds. The first bomb a man on the ground knew of was the last, because the sound arrived after the explosions. The weapon to break the siege was not hidden in a warehouse. It was already overhead. The problem was learning to aim it with enough precision to drop it almost on top of your own men, and that problem had never truly been solved. Not yet. The siege began, as sieges do, with fire. In the early hours of January 21, 1968, North Vietnamese forces struck the hills and the base at once. On Hill 861, they nearly broke through the marine perimeter before being thrown back in close fighting. Down on the main base, a rocket and artillery barrage walked across the compound and found the most catastrophic possible target. It hit the main ammunition dump. More than 1,500 tons of shells and explosives began to cook off in a chain of blasts that lasted for hours and hurled unexploded rounds across the base like burning confetti. Fires spread, bunkers collapsed. Some of the tear gas stored on the base ruptured, and clouds of it drifted through the smoke, so that Marines fought the fires in gas masks, choking, half-blind. In a matter of hours, the great majority of the base's ammunition was simply gone. The message was brutal and clear. The enemy could reach into the heart of the base whenever the weather let him, and there was very little the defenders could do to stop the shells from coming. This was the trap that had swallowed the French. A garrison pinned in place, its supplies burning. Its lifeline dependent entirely on aircraft that had to fly into a valley ringed by enemy guns. And now we arrive at the cruelest part of the story, the part where American air power, the very thing meant to be the salvation, first showed how badly it could fail the men it was supposed to protect. The airstrip at Khe Sanh became the most dangerous piece of pavement in the world. Every transport aircraft that came in to deliver ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fresh troops had to descend into range of enemy gunners, who had the runway zeroed. The workhorse was the C-130 Hercules, a 4-engine transport that could haul heavy loads. But a C-130, sitting still on that strip, engines running, cargo doors open, was an enormous target. Enemy mortar crews waited for exactly that moment. On February 10th, a Marine C-130 came in, loaded with fuel bladders, and was hit as it landed. It caught fire and burned on the runway. Men died. After more losses and near misses, the decision came down that the big C-130s would no longer land at Khe Sanh at all. They were too valuable and too vulnerable to risk on the ground. But the base still needed hundreds of tons of supplies every week, and there was no road and no other way in, so the crews learned to deliver without ever coming to a stop. In one method, the aircraft roared in only a few feet above the runway, dragging a parachute behind it that snapped open and yanked the cargo pallets out the open rear door, so that the load slammed down and skidded along the strip, while the plane itself never touched the ground and clawed back into the sky. In another method, the crew rigged the load to a parachute and released it from low altitude, so it floated down onto a marked drop zone. There was even a technique where the pallet was extracted by a parachute without the plane descending nearly as low, letting the aircraft stay a little higher and a little safer. The techniques worked, and they kept the base alive, but they were brutally imperfect. Loads skidded off the runway into the mud. Pallets scattered across the cratered ground. A runaway load could crush anything and anyone in its path. And every run demanded that a pilot fly a large, slow aircraft straight down the throat of an enemy who had every meter of that airstrip carefully ranged. The men who flew those missions, and the ground crews who sprinted out under fire to drag the pallets to safety, kept a besieged garrison supplied by sheer nerve. Resupplying the hill outposts was worse still. Helicopters trying to reach the surrounded hilltops were shot out of the sky so often that the Marines developed a desperate, tightly choreographed tactic. They would mass their helicopters and send them in all at once, escorted by attack aircraft that saturated the enemy gun positions with bombs and smoke in the exact seconds the helicopters darted in to drop their loads and flee. They called it the super gaggle. It was resupply as a cavalry charge, and men died running it. Then came the night that made the ghost of Dien Bien Phu feel utterly real. A few kilometers to the west of Khe Sanh sat a small special forces camp called NVA. It was held by a handful of American Green Berets and a larger force of Allied irregulars, including local Montagnard fighters and Vietnamese soldiers. On the night of February 7, 1968, the North Vietnamese attacked it, and they brought something no one on the American side had faced before in this war. They brought tanks. Light amphibious tanks, PT-76 models supplied by the Soviet bloc, rumbled out of the darkness and crushed through the camp's wire. For the defenders, it was a nightmare made of steel. Their light weapons could barely scratch the armor. The garrison fought through the night, calling in artillery and airstrikes almost on top of their own positions, but the tanks and the infantry behind them overran the camp. One Green Beret Sergeant First Class, Eugene Ashley Jr., rallied a force of survivors and led repeated assaults back up the hill toward the overrun command bunker to try to free trapped Americans. On his fifth attempt, he was killed. He was later awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor. The survivors of Lang Vei who could escape fled toward Khe Sanh. The fall of the camp sent a shudder through the entire garrison. If the enemy had tanks, then the base itself might one day face them. The trap felt like it was closing. And yet, even as the ground situation grew darker, something was changing in the sky above the valley. The failure of air power to protect that first burning transport plane was giving way to a different kind of air power, one applied with a discipline and a density the world had never witnessed over a single battlefield. The answer to the siege was not a weapon the Americans lacked. It was a way of using the weapons they had, all of them, all at once, all the time. That was the meaning of Niagara. Around the clock, in nearly any weather, American aircraft stacked up over Khe Sanh in layers. Fighter bombers like the F-4 Phantom and the A-4 Skyhawk and the A-6 Intruder rolled in on enemy trenches, gun positions, and troop concentrations, often guided to their targets by forward air controllers circling overhead in small propeller planes, men whose entire job was to watch the ground and direct the fire. Above them, higher up, the B-52 bombers arrived in their cells of 3, dropping their loads through cloud onto coordinates fed to them from the ground. The tempo was staggering. At the height of the operation, a formation of heavy bombers struck the area around Khe Sanh roughly every 90 minutes or so, day and night, week after week. The ground never stopped shaking. To pour that much explosive into a small area without killing the very Marines it was meant to save required precision that did not exist by eyesight. especially through the low clouds and fog that so often smothered the valley. So the Americans leaned on radar. A ground-based radar bombing system could track an aircraft and tell its crew the exact instant to release, allowing bombers to hit a target they could not see through solid overcast. The Marines had their own radar system for directing attack aircraft onto close targets. Together, these systems let American planners drop bombs by instrument, in the dark, in the rain, with a confidence in their coordinates that grew as the battle went on. And as that confidence grew, the planners did something that had been considered almost unthinkable. They began walking the giant B-52 strikes closer and closer to the Marine lines. Early in the war, a firebreak of thousands of meters had been kept between an arc-light strike and any friendly troops, because the blast and fragmentation of that many bombs was simply too dangerous. At Khe Sanh, as the crews and controllers refined their methods, that safety distance shrank. The bombing box crept in from 3,000 meters to 2,000, and eventually the planners were bringing strikes to within roughly 1 kilometer of the Marine trenches, and in some accounts even closer. For the North Vietnamese, this destroyed their single best defense. Their doctrine had always been to hug the enemy, to stay so close to American positions that the big bombers could not be used against them. Now the big bombers were being used against them anyway, landing so near the wire that Marines felt the ground buck beneath their boots and watched the pressure wave ripple across puddles a few hundred meters away. The enemy's approach trenches, painstakingly dug toward the base night after night, were being erased by the ton. Through all of this, on the hills the defenders held, and nowhere did they hold with more open defiance than on Hill 881 South, where Captain Dabney's Marines lived under fire for the entire siege. Cut off, shelled daily, resupplied only by the desperate helicopter runs, they turned their endurance into a ritual. Each morning, under enemy observation, a couple of Marines would raise an American flag on an improvised pole. The North Vietnamese gunners knew the ritual too, and they would try to drop mortar rounds on the men during the raising. So the Marines turned it into a race. The buglers among them would sound the call, the flag would go up fast, and the men would dive for cover before the shells arrived. It was small, it was almost absurd, but every morning that flag went up, it told the entire valley that this hill had not fallen, and it would not fall. Down on the base, the daily arithmetic of survival ground on. Men lived underground in bunkers and trenches, emerging into a landscape stripped of vegetation, cratered and littered with the debris of 2 months of shelling. Incoming fire could come at any moment, and the Marines learned the difference between the sounds, the whisper of a rocket, the cough of a mortar, the crack of artillery from the hills. They gave their most dangerous stretches of ground grim nicknames. Casualties trickled in day after day. A man here, 2 men there, the slow bleeding of a siege rather than the sudden slaughter of a single battle. And still the base held, because the sky over it had become a shield of falling steel. By late February and into March, the balance in the valley had quietly, decisively shifted, though the men in the trenches could not always see it. The enemy's great offensive had stalled. Every time the North Vietnamese massed to attack, the sensors and the spotters and the radar picked up the movement, and the bombs came down before the assault could gather its full weight. The trenches that had crept toward the wire stopped creeping. Prisoners and later analysis told a story of North Vietnamese units being shattered by air attack while they were still forming up, of battalions bled white before they ever reached the American lines. Whatever Giap and his commanders had intended, the plan to strangle Khe Sanh into surrender had failed against a weight of firepower that had no precedent in the history of warfare over a single spot on the earth. And here we come to a hard truth, the kind that separates history from myth. What broke the siege was not a clever gadget or a lone hero, though there were many heroes. What broke the siege was mass. It was the almost incomprehensible tonnage of high explosive that American aircraft poured onto the hills around that base over roughly 2.5 months. The commonly cited figure is close to 100,000 tons of bombs dropped in the Khe Sanh area during the campaign. That number should be treated with some care, because different sources count different things and the accounting is not perfectly clean. But even the more conservative tallies describe tens of thousands of tons falling on an area only a few kilometers across. It was, by many measures, the most concentrated bombing in support of a single ground position in the history of war up to that time. The B-52 strikes alone accounted for a huge share of it, flying thousands of sorties and dropping tens of thousands of tons over the course of the operation. In late March, the pressure eased. The enemy began pulling units back, melting away from the hills as quietly as they had come. On April 1, 1968, the Americans launched a relief operation to open the road and formally break the siege. It was called Operation Pegasus, and it was led by the 1st Cavalry Division, an air-mobile unit that used helicopters to leapfrog its battalions along the high ground beside Route 9, seizing key terrain while combat engineers repaired the road behind them. As they advanced, they found a battlefield transformed into something out of a nightmare, hillsides burned bare, cratered beyond recognition, littered with the wreckage of an army that had been pounded from the air for weeks. On April 8th, the relief force linked up with the defenders of Khe Sanh. The road was open. The 77-day siege was, by the official reckoning, over. The base had held. There would be no second Dien Bien Phu. The cost is where the story stops being simple, and where honesty matters more than triumph. The American dead at Khe Sanh are harder to count than one might expect, because the fighting sprawled across the hill outposts, the main base, the relief operation, and the surrounding actions, and different official accounts drew the boundaries of the battle differently. The figure often given for Marines killed in the defense of the base and its hills during the main siege is around 200. But when the earlier hill fights, the fall of NVA, the relief operation, and related actions are folded in, the toll of American and Allied dead climbs much higher, into many hundreds. Hundreds more were wounded. Every one of those numbers was a young man, most of them barely into their 20s, who lived for weeks in a hole in the ground under a sky that rained fire. The enemy dead are harder still to count, and here the myth must be handled with real caution. The number of North Vietnamese bodies actually recovered and confirmed around Khe Sanh was relatively modest, well under 2,000 by the counts that were tallied. But American commanders, extrapolating from that count, and from the sheer weight of bombs dropped, estimated total North Vietnamese dead in the tens of thousands, with figures of 10,000 to 15,000 widely repeated. The truth is that no one knows. The enemy carried away many of their dead, as was their practice, and the bombing often left little to count. The high estimates may be close to correct, or they may reflect the natural human urge to justify a terrible expenditure of force, with an equally terrible enemy toll. What can be said with confidence is that the North Vietnamese divisions around Khe Sanh were badly hurt, and that air power did the great majority of the hurting. And then came the decision that turned a hard-won defense into one of the most bitter debates of the entire war. A few months after the siege was lifted, the American command concluded that Khe Sanh combat base was no longer worth holding. The strategic thinking had shifted. The general who had insisted on the base was on his way out of command, and a new mobile approach to the area was favored. So in the summer of 1968, American forces methodically dismantled the base they had bled to defend. They filled in the bunkers, tore up the airstrip, and hauled away or destroyed anything of value, so that the enemy could not claim they had captured it intact. Men who had watched their friends die to hold that red dirt now watched engineers erase it from the map. To many of them it felt like a betrayal, and the anger of it never fully faded. The North Vietnamese, for their part, treated the American withdrawal as proof that they had forced the enemy off the ground they wanted, and to this day the site is presented in Vietnam as a victory over the Americans. That is the riddle of Khe Sanh, and it has never been fully solved. Some historians argue that the entire siege was a masterstroke of American firepower, a battle in which Westmoreland baited the enemy into concentrating in the open and then annihilated him from the air, exactly as the French had once hoped to do and failed. In this view, Khe Sanh was the anti-Dien Bien Phu, the moment the trap was set the other way around. Others argue almost the reverse. They suggest that Khe Sanh was a distraction that worked against the Americans, that the North Vietnamese may have used the threat to the base to fix Westmoreland's gaze on a remote corner of the country and pull his attention and his reserves out toward the border in the very weeks before they launched the Tet Offensive. That offensive was the massive, coordinated wave of surprise attacks that erupted across cities and bases throughout South Vietnam at the end of January 1968, striking even the grounds of the American embassy in the capital. In this second reading, the enemy never seriously intended to storm and hold Khe Sanh at all. They only needed the Americans to believe they might, and to look west, while the real blow fell everywhere else. There is a further layer to the argument, because the two readings are not entirely at odds. It is possible that the North Vietnamese leadership itself was divided, or that they intended Khe Sanh to be a genuine opportunity if it opened, and a useful diversion if it did not. Giap had won at Dien Bien Phu by patience and by turning an enemy strongpoint into a tomb. If Khe Sanh had cracked, he would have had a second, even more spectacular victory over a far greater power. When it did not crack, the mere threat of it had still drawn American resources and dominated American headlines for months. Seen that way, the enemy could not entirely lose at Khe Sanh, and the Americans could not entirely win. The debate over which side was really diverting the other has never ended, because both sides could point to the outcome and plausibly claim they had achieved what they set out to do. Captain William Dabney, who held Hill 881 South through all of it, was awarded the Navy Cross decades later, in a ceremony long after the war, when the paperwork and the memory were finally set right. He did not seek attention for what he had done. When men who were there spoke of the siege in later years, they rarely spoke of grand strategy or the arguments of historians. They spoke of the mud, the noise, the friends who did not come home, and the strange, terrible beauty of watching a B-52 strike land close enough to feel it in your chest, and knowing that it was falling on the enemy and not on you. One of the enduring images they left behind is simple. It is the memory of that flag going up on the hill each morning, fast, before the shells could find it. A small act of defiance repeated day after day, until the day the enemy finally went away. The doctrine that filled the sky over Khe Sanh did not end when the base was dismantled. It became a foundation of the way the American military fights. The idea that a surrounded or outnumbered force on the ground can be sustained and protected by overwhelming, precisely directed air power runs straight from that valley to the wars that followed. Decades later, in the mountains of Afghanistan, small teams of American and Allied soldiers pinned down by larger enemy forces would survive because a controller on the ground could call down aircraft with a precision that the men at Khe Sanh could only dream of. The sensors that were first scattered around those hills to feel an enemy moving in the dark were the crude ancestors of the vast surveillance networks that hang over battlefields today. And the hard argument that ran through Khe Sanh, whether it is wise to plant a force in a fixed, exposed position and dare the enemy to come and be destroyed, is an argument that American commanders have kept having ever since, in different valleys, on different maps, with different names. Today, the plateau where the base once stood is quiet. It sits in a reunified Vietnam, and where Marines once burrowed into red clay, there is now a small museum and a memorial, visited by travelers and by aging veterans from both sides who come to stand on ground that once shook without pause. The runway is gone, the bunkers are gone, the hills that the Marines named and bled for are green again, the craters softened by more than half a century of rain. It is hard, standing there in the calm, to imagine the noise. But the question that valley posed has not gone quiet at all. Khe Sanh asked what happens when one side can put more destructive force onto a single patch of earth than the other side can absorb, and whether holding a piece of ground is worth what it costs to hold it. The men on those hills answered the first question with their endurance and with a sky full of bombs. The second question, the one about whether it was worth it, they left to us. The base was saved and then thrown away. The enemy was shattered and then claimed victory. 6,000 men held a line that their own commanders erased a few months later. What broke the siege of Khe Sanh was not a single secret weapon. It was the decision to pour one of the heaviest concentrations of firepower ever aimed at a single battlefield onto a few square kilometers of jungle, and the men who lived beneath it never forgot the sound. 77 days, 6,000 defenders, one valley that refused to become the graveyard everyone feared. That is what happened at Khe Sanh, and that is why, more than half a century later, we are still arguing about what it meant.